Tonight I will be telling 5 stories, from creepers outside of windows to the paranormal, and closing things off with a cult story. Thank you to all of tonight's writers. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. Stories can either be submitted at my subreddit, r/slumberreads, or my email that can be found in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Stay safe out there, enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I moved out of home about 3 years ago, and have fairly regularly insisted on having rooms in the various apartments I've lived in that either don't have windows, or at the very least have shutters that close. It always struck me as strange when my housemates would ask me, "Why do you always keep them closed?" I never gave them any details other than the usual excuses. Wanting to sleep in, keeps the temperature how I like it, all the usual excuses. None of them have ever known. For a bit of background, my old family house was in what you'd call a safe neighborhood, if such a thing exists. Nothing ever really happened and it was just kind of boring. I'm an only child and my parents usually gave me relative autonomy. They trusted me enough not to do anything stupid and always made sure I was with someone if I left the house. And for a while, it all seemed pretty normal. 17 years I lived in that house, and it was in that last one that I first started getting a weird feeling. It tends to be the paranoid feeling you get when someone's watching you. Everyone experiences it at least once, and it's usually little more than an overactive imagination, but this time felt different. My bedroom used to look out over our backyard. It was generally pretty blocked off. There was no street access, and the fence line was hidden by a few big trees, so I felt normally pretty safe. This was a time I also liked to have my window blinds open. I'm a big early bird, and it was a very relaxing thing to be awoken by the sun every morning. However, one night I couldn't get sleep. For the record, I'm usually a pretty heavy sleeper. I never really stress over stuff like exams or finances before I sleep, so this was odd for me. At first I couldn't place it, at least until about 11:30 at night. I could hear a curious tapping on my window, almost as if someone was throwing rocks at it. Looking out into the yard, I couldn't see anything, but I could just feel uneasy, like something was out there. I'd never felt this way before and I didn't like it. The next morning, I asked my parents about this. They hadn't heard anything, but told me if I was on edge to maybe listen to something as I slept. I tried it that night and, to my concern, it didn't seem to help. I couldn't hear any tapping anymore, but I still felt uneasy. Looking out into the yard, I still couldn't work out why. Even under a full moon, when my backyard was illuminated, I couldn't see anything. I thought through all of this, I must just be losing my mind. That was the first night I ever closed the blinds. The next morning I still felt on edge and my parents finally decided that it wasn't me that was the problem. They'd never seen me act like this, so they were just as concerned as I was. As it was Friday, they told me I could have a friend over, hopefully to ease my mind a bit. To their credit, it kinda did. My blinds were still shut, but my friend at least understood and helped to take my mind off of it, even just for a while. Us being teenagers, we naturally were awake pretty late. The room only lit by a lamp as we talked into the night. My friend, clearly seeing that her being there was having a positive effect, and finally convinced me that I was just being silly, and that it was probably just a bird or something, and that it was probably gone by now. That was until the next morning. How the mail delivery service in my town works on the weekend is all mail comes on Saturday in the mid-afternoon. So my parents were naturally curious the next day when a weathered envelope had turned up on our doorstep with no stamps or anything on it. Unmistakably though, it was for me. My first name was on the front. My hands had started shaking as I was handed the envelope, and turned to terrified screams as I read its contents. On a single, grubby sheet of paper in a scroll that was just barely legible. "Who's your friend?" I couldn't stay in the house that night. I just couldn't. My friend was more than happy to have me at hers for the rest of the weekend. We didn't do much except stay in her room, me huddled in the corner with a bat. By the time I finally convinced myself to come home, my parents had redone our entire security system. Floodlights on the front and backyards. Deadbolts in every door and window lock. Burglar alarms. The works. Even the trees and hedges in the back had been cut away so there was no way of anyone hiding. Our neighbors too had been put on alert for anything suspicious. That night, it took me a long time to get to sleep. My parents tried as much as they could to stay with me, but even I knew my room wasn't big enough for me and 2 grown adults. At about midnight, I finally managed to close my eyes, with great difficulty. Nothing happened that night. 4 days passed before things started getting weird again. I never went anywhere alone now, and it felt like I was under constant watch because, technically, I was. The only time I ever spent alone was in my room. The blinds now closed for good. It made me sad to be robbed of something I loved so much, but peace of mind was more important. As I was settling in for the night, I couldn't help but dwell on who had been watching me, and even more terrifying, for how long. I'd almost managed to fall asleep when it happened. The floodlights went off. At first, I thought nothing of it. My neighbors have cats who tend to roam, and the floodlight sensors are very easy to trip. After about a minute, the thin lines of light in my upturned blinds disappeared, but then it happened again. 3 more times it happened, and each time I was less and less inclined to sleep. I was shaking again as they finally went off, but remained silent. They didn't come on again, but in their place was a very definite sound of a footstep on concrete, like the concrete that stood out before our yard, just outside of the range of the lights. He can't see me, kept telling myself. He can't see me. It's pitch black, and he can't see me. It felt like an hour before I finally pulled myself up enough to see what was there. I know I shouldn't have. I was terrified to see anything, but I just had to know. Peering through the slits in my blinds, it took 5 seconds before I finally screamed. Below me was a large man. I couldn't see much of him, but it was undeniable. He was looking at me. Not at my window, at me, right in my eyes. Almost as if he knew where I'd been the entire time. All I could make out as I crashed to the ground in hysterics was his wide eyes and a large Cheshire grin, chuckling as he continued to stare. The police never found him. Never knew how he managed to get into our yard, or even what he was doing. My parents sent me to stay with relatives for the rest of the year. I wouldn't go anywhere near the house, not even to see my parents again. No one I've lived with knows this. I'm terrified of looking out my windows, knowing at any point he could be there, and I'd never even know it. Children appeared on my lawn much too often, trespassing on a dare. I thought that was annoying as it was, but it got complicated when I found that some of them were no longer alive. The crawling boy was one of the dead ones, the only one I'd seen so far, and the hardest to get off my property. That is, if he ever left. The living children were usually in their school uniforms when I discovered them in the daylight. Sometimes they were alone. More often they came in pairs or little groups of 3s and 4s, milling on the grass that stretched from the estate for miles on all sides. They always ran away screaming when I appeared on the front porch through the French windows. I'd be left standing there in my bathrobe, in early morning grumpiness, blinking in confusion like a newborn kitten with the sun in my eyes while they pointed at me, screaming in laughter, and ran right back into the trees where they'd come from. Another few days and there would be another group of them. I never had to yell or chase them out with a hunting rifle. All I did was show up with my coffee, and they'd dart back between the trees like fawns, gleefully terrified. There's no mystery as to where they came from. There was a school on the other side of the forest bordering my estate, a distinguished academy that was part day school and part boarding school. I have no other neighbors for miles. As to why they came, I knew that too. They dared each other, as I've mentioned before. It was almost a school tradition. I've been told that my house, the Hartfield Mansion, a glorified cabin if anything, was considered haunted because of how isolated it was. The adults told me this half-jokingly, but the children were serious. To be fair, it might have also been due to the fact that I and my late wife had spread some unsavory rumors about the area. We'd done it so nobody nearing retirement age would be tempted to move out here, and interrupt our solitude with their golf games and outdoor tea parties. I'm an old man now with a gimp leg, and I have little tolerance for all this, but the rumors drew the children in, sometimes to terrible and permanent consequences. Well, I did have the satisfaction of being feared, if not respected, as the ghoul of Hartfield Manor. It nettled me that I wasn't scary enough to keep them from coming back. It wasn't just for my sake that I wanted them to stay away. The strip of woodlands they had to cross to get to my property was a dangerous place. Much too often, children had gone missing. Search parties would come out the other side of the forest disheartened and empty-handed. I had to do my civic duty as well, when I could. Whenever I noticed frightened children emerge from the trees, starved and crying, lost for a day or more, I would have to care for them at the house until someone came to pick them up. My wife was an angel to these bedraggled miscreants. I stayed out of the way and made phone calls to the school and the police. Of course, this obligatory kindness ruined my reputation for being the local monster of the haunted house. But I think those children were too traumatized by their misadventure to really be disappointed in me. If anything, their near-death experience in the forest amplified the danger, and thus the excitement of daring each other to do it again. The older students would try and learn and never return, but there would always be younger ones coming in every new school year, learning of the legend of Hartfield Manor from their peers and getting suckered into crossing the forest again. They would be fine if they kept a straight line until they'd gotten to the other side, I always said, but the forest was a treacherous place, and it was easy to lose one's bearings and wander for days. My wife used to tell me to practice being a grandfather to them instead of grumbling so much. But after she died, kidney failure, a few years ago, I was in no mood to play Santa Claus to a group of children who set out with the intent to cause trouble. I had grandchildren of my own, but my only daughter, Adelaide, worked and lived in the city. She rarely visited with the kids after her mother died. In my stately isolation, I spent my time wondering whether she would ever call or visit her old man. It didn't help feeling lonely when I had too much company of the wrong kind. A ghoul they had called me, and a ghoul I would be. The truth was, these children haunted me more than I haunted them. The school was growing tired of my phone calls advising the staff to keep their children under control. They assured me they were doing all they could. Still, I would wake up many a morning hearing their stifled laughter on the field. I wanted to stay indoors despite them, but they would venture closer and closer to the house until I was goaded to come out and scare them back into the woods. I'd had enough. So one day, when I saw a young boy lying on his side on the grass in the soft light of dusk, all alone, I didn't think to investigate. I went straight indoors and called the school. "There's another one," I said. I was told there were fences put up on the other side. Why are they still getting through? "There are fences, Mr. Hartfield," said the principal. It was the end of the school day, and she sounded a touch worn out. "They've been up for a month now." "Well, there's another one on my property. A boy. The children might have started climbing the fences. I'm going to have to call the police, you know." "What's his name, sir? Have you spoken to him? We'll contact his parents as soon as we can identify him." "I haven't spoken to him. He's taking a nap on my grass." She paused for a moment at this. "Is he hurt?" "Well, I don't know, but it looks like something's wrong. He's just lying there like..." I stopped. My gaze had wandered out the windows, and I noticed that the boy had gone. I sighed. "Hold on." I put the principal on hold and took a walk around. Nothing. If the boy had heard me and run away, or if some animal had dragged him back into the woods, that was not my problem anymore. Coldness was settling into my bones, but I felt a pang in my chest recalling the look of the boy, small and frail, his white school shirt an offensive contrast in the green of the manicured lawn, just lying there, curled on his side, facing away from me into the forest. I tried not to think of it again. The next time I noticed him, 2 days had passed and it was getting on to 10 o'clock at night, later than I had ever seen any of the other children before. Even when they were lost, I knew then there was something very wrong. The boy was on his side again, lying on the neat grass that the part-time groundskeeper Martin had carefully cut that morning. His white school shirt glowed faintly in the moonlight. There was no blood that I could see. but his uniform seemed a bit tattered, old, and off color. I called out. I could see the small body shiver briefly, but there was no other answer. Suddenly afraid for him, I limped over, going as fast as I could despite my bad leg. By then the boy had rolled over on his back, his head, dark hair, untidy and matted, turned my way. And then after a slow, painstaking moment, he shifted heavily onto his stomach and began to crawl toward me. I slowed to a stop before I was halfway across the field, just staring. The boy had a hollow, gaping mouth look about him. His jaw hung loose and his eyes were glassy and blank as he dragged himself forward on his hands and elbows, clawing at the grass. His limp legs followed behind, jerking at odd angles and dragging behind him, while his head lolled on its scrawny neck this way and that, as if it were too heavy to hold up. Slowly, steadily, silently, he approached. It was such a bizarre and grotesque sight I couldn't look away, nor could I move. At first, the same pang of pity hit me. The boy was obviously badly hurt, but then the feeling sank into dread, and though a part of my brain shouted, "Help him, he's hurt. You could still save him," another part, though quieter, cut through to my senses much quicker. "He's already dead. Get out of here." "But," I said softly to myself, torn. But my instincts insisted, "You can't do anything. Look at him." I did look. It looked like the boy was breathing through his mouth, but his jaw was hanging so strangely, a tiny bit too wide, a silent scream. I could almost imagine the sound of his breathing, shaky, wheezing, pained. I didn't stick around for him to get close enough for me to hear it. At that point, I suspected there was no breathing at all. Now he was close enough I could see there were no whites in his eyes, just a flat darkness. His shriveled little fingers were pale and skeletal on the grass. I turned around and fled, slowed down by my bad leg, but though I was slower than I wanted to be, the boy was even more so. I got into the house in plenty of time and made sure to lock all the doors and windows on the ground floor before I called the police. Then I hurried up to the top floor to be as far from the ground as possible. From one of the higher windows, I could survey the field overlooking the forest, and there was no boy. The police, however, had arrived. In the near distance, I saw a couple of patrol vehicles pull into view with their sirens silent and their headlights cutting across my empty lawn. They were used to my phone calls about the children, but even they knew I never called this late at night, this breathless. I made my way back down to receive them. After I explained the situation as generally as I could, they agreed to scour the area. I was made to sit down in one of the porch chairs. I had overexerted myself for my age, they told me. Every now and then, I would catch them throwing an odd look my way. I wanted to have the forest rangers search the woods for the boy, preferably well armed. But the officers told me they couldn't justify the effort without evidence that there was any danger, or that there even was a boy to find. If he really were hurt, they reasoned, he wouldn't have been able to get away so quickly, nor would he have wanted to. An officer asked, "Do you want us to search your house too, sir?" As if humoring me, or suspecting something. Exhausted, I leaned against the wall and nodded, "Please." They found nothing. To be kind, they told me that it might have been some kid playing a prank, but I knew they thought I had imagined everything. There had been no recent missing child cases reported in the past few days, since I'd seen the boy the first time. Meanwhile, there had been several warnings issued by the school staff during general assemblies. They had even invited police officers and forest rangers to talk to the children and scare them with authority. That kept them away for a while. It was true I was having a quieter few weeks than usual, but then, what of the boy? I then thought to ask if the missing school children on record had been accounted for, dead or alive. The officers glanced at each other and then at the dark, waving silhouette of the forest. "Of course not," one of them said. "Who knows how many of them are still in there?" They told me to keep in touch, then became scarce. They promised to contact the school for any information they might have on the boy, but I never heard back from them on that end. Either there were no missing boy cases, or there were too many. Another 2 days passed by uneventfully. I was more careful about taking all my medication, but I also found myself dusting off my old hunting rifle and practicing my sights on them. Then the next day, I saw the body again, lying there on the grass facing the forest. I merely stared from behind the window. It was strange seeing him again in broad daylight. Seeing anybody, really, when I knew the school was off for the holidays. And as I stared, that little head flopped over on its broken neck and looked my way again. And just as it began to turn itself over and start the long, slow crawl to my house, I had drawn the curtains and rushed to the phone. The police came a little more hesitantly this time. I couldn't figure out why at first. They performed the same procedure all over again. No boy, dead or otherwise. They asked me if I was on medication, and then I understood. They thought I was losing my mind. Angrily, I sent them away. I knew that if I kept calling them like this, they would stop responding when I needed them most. I would be the man who cried boy. They would say it was a mental condition born out of grief for my wife, a lonely man's yearning for his daughter and grandchildren. And what if it was? I had no way to convince them otherwise. All I knew was I had nowhere else to go. If I were to call Adelaide and plead with her to take me somewhere else, she would leave me in some care facility for the elderly. My pride wouldn't let me leave the house, and so I had to put up with living children and now the dead ones somewhere on my lawn. Every time the specter of the boy returned, I learned something new about it. I knew that every time I looked at the body long enough, it would somehow feel my gaze, and as if summoned, it would turn itself and approach me. No matter where he appeared on the lawn, he was always a good distance away, almost at the edge of the forest. But when he turned over, he would always look directly at the window I was standing at, no matter what floor I was on. As soon as I looked away to call for help or find a way to defend myself, the crawling spectre disappeared, and I didn't know if it was because it had vanished into the netherworld, or because it was somewhere else on the estate, perhaps somewhere closer. Sometimes I fought my reflexes and kept my eyes on him before he could blink out of sight, but it hurt to watch, and I felt the life drain out of me the closer he got. I had to look away. I mentioned my old hunting rifle earlier. I kept its heavy case unlocked on the kitchen table beside the window. It was an eyesore there, next to the cut crystal vases and the ceramic salt shaker shaped like a cat. My wife would never let me leave it there, if she had been alive to see it. I tried not to think of her. I only wondered if one could kill a thing that was already dead. I made sure the gun was close at hand at all times, and only threw the quickest of glances at the lawn from the corner of my eyes every morning to ascertain it was empty. This was hard to do since I was horribly nearsighted, and the corner of my vision fell out of range of my prescription glasses, so I had to turn my head around to look a little more than I was comfortable with. If I noticed the boy's form again, at random hours of the day, my old heart would quiver and stop for a bit. At least I imagined it did, but I had to immediately look away. As if cutting my gaze off quickly enough, I could pretend I hadn't really seen it, but the thing wanted to be seen. What could it want with me? After the police had done their half-hearted job the second time, I had Martin, the groundskeeper, help me scour the estate for any evidence that the schoolboy had been dragged around by a wild animal, or perhaps fallen down a ravine and broken every bone in its body. We found absolutely nothing. Martin protested at the idea of digging up the estate to look for a buried child. I began to wonder if the body was somewhere in the forest, but that was beyond my curiosity to find out. "Maybe you're a bit too lonely," said my daughter, predictably. I had her on the cordless phone, telling her of my ghostly encounters, as I stood on the porch looking out over the empty field. "Do you want to adopt another dog?" she said. I barked a laugh until her eloquent silence told me she was going to hang up if I didn't stop and take her seriously. The family dog, Old Chief, had died long before my wife did. There was a dog flap in the kitchen door leading out into the field, and I often caught myself looking at it sadly, but I had no energy for another dog. That's what I found myself thinking one day when, on an overcast morning, I saw the dead child crawling across the field toward my patio doors. This was new behavior. I hadn't even noticed him before he was already moving, as if he had decided to sneak up on me, as if he knew he could. While he was still a good distance away, I opened the French windows and stood on the porch with my gun lifted, but my poor eyes couldn't get him on the crosshairs. I couldn't even find him through the scope. The specter just disappeared from sight until I lowered the gun again and could see him plain as day. I could probably get him at close range, I thought, but I was no longer sure I wanted to, or if it would do any good. I kept feeling a stab of guilt for not being able to help him, in life or in death, for not being able to put him out of his misery. So much for this good old ghoul of the manor. I stepped back into the house and closed the doors. I drew all the curtains and packed my gun away, feeling my weak old heart grow faint. It would take a long time for the child to reach my house. I could get away by then, or call somebody. But who knows? But who would be faster? The crawling spectre? Or the police? Or an old man hobbling away on his bad leg? The spectre had always been slow but steady, like the tortoise in that old children's story in a race against a hare. But also like the tortoise in the story, he would reach his destination sooner or later. So there I was leaning against the granite counter with my pills spread across before me, and a glass of water trembling in my hands. The entire lower floor of the house was darkened by the heavy curtains and blinds drawn against the windows. I knew death was coming for me, and that it would be slow and steady and silent. But I never thought I'd be alone when it happened. I was considering calling up Adele again, and finally telling her I was willing to be taken to a care facility in that city I hated so much, when from the corner of my eye, I caught a silent movement. There was a quick wave of sunlight flashing from the outside. The dog flap at the kitchen door was swinging gently back into place. I was right about the sound of his breathing. I used to work as a caretaker at a care home for a few years. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, but this is what led me to quit my job. Mr. Charles Moore, or at least, that was his name when I met him, was an old man. He never told me his age, but I figured he was about 90 years old when I met him. By he, I meant his mortal shell. As for how old Mr. Moore truly was, I don't have a clue. If not for his old man's body and his raspy voice, you wouldn't think he was a man of his age. He had a sense of humor, and often bantered with and played jokes on the caretakers. He didn't seem to mind the dreary atmosphere of the care home at all. I wish I never met him. One day, in the cafeteria after dinner time, I figure it was my second year working at the place. Mr. Moore beckoned me to join him at his table. He was sitting alone, while most other old folks were playing cards, watching TV, and doing what old folks do. "I don't think we've ever gotten to know each other," Mr. Moore said, extending his hand. "I'm Charles Moore, and you can call me Charles. What's your name, son?" "David," I replied, and shook his hand. "Nice to meet you, Charles." "Are you a military man, David?" Charles asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Royal Marines. How can you tell?" I had served in the Marines for a short stint some years before, and served for a while in Syria. When you observe people for as many years as I've lived, David, you can easily notice patterns, Charles said. "I was a Marine man myself. When I watched you, I recognized the way you walk and the way you talk." "That's impressive, Charles," I said. "How long did you serve?" "If you are referring to my service in the Royal Marines, I've served 34 years, he replied. "I began my service at age 18, and was discharged honorably in 73. "So you served during the World War and the Falklands War?" My interest was piqued. "The things you must have seen." "Yep," Charles replied. "I was among the troops who landed on Normandy in 44. I was a paratrooper, to be more specific." "That's amazing, Charles," I replied. I wasn't trying to be polite. I was impressed. "It is, isn't it?" Charles responded. "And yet I'm here in a care home. The greatest generation. All dead or in care homes now. Funny, isn't it?" He laughed. I didn't know how to respond to his bitter humor. A moment of silence passed and Charles took a sip from his mug of tea. Suddenly, he turned and looked me straight in the eye. "David," he said, his gaze unfaltering, "I have to tell you something about me. Can I trust you?" "Of course, Charles," I said. I felt surprised but decided to listen. "What do you want to tell me?" "David," Charles said, What if I told you that Charles isn't my real name? What is the old bloke up to? I thought. Then I realized he wasn't joking. Well, I wouldn't tell anyone if you didn't want me to. Your information is safe with me. Alright, Charles said and exhaled deeply. My name was Fritz Weber a long time ago, and Velikai before that. Anything before that? I don't remember anymore. Velikai was born in 1899 in Petrograd, Russia, which later became Leningrad, and today, St. Petersburg, to a family of poor peasants. Like most peasants, they despised the heavy taxes and conscription imposed on them by the aristocracy. In 1914, Velikai and his father were conscripted to the Russian army. Velikai killed many Germans in the war, but his father died in the war to a German sharpshooter. Velikai hated the Russian Tsar, but hated him even more after his father's death. In 1917, he joined the Bolsheviks in overthrowing the monarchy, and was hailed as a hero by his village. He believed very strongly in the communist movement, and he was the party representative at his village. He had a wife and children, and lived a happy life tilling the communal farms. He longed that one day he and his children would live in the communist utopia described by Marx. Velikai loved his children, but he loved his country more. In 1941, the Germans began their infamous campaign, Operation Barbarossa. Velikai had to pick up his rifle again to defend his home and his family. He was sent down south to Stalingrad, where he, like a million other Soviets, fought a vicious battle to repel the fascists. He fought in the trenches, and he fought on the streets. The battle killed a million Soviets, and Velikai was among them, when, fighting at close quarters in the Red October steel factory, he felt a German bayonet plunge into his ribcage. He felt a flood of regret that he would have to leave this life behind. Alas, he had no choice, and he became Fritz Weber. Fritz was a very hot-headed man. He wasn't old enough to have fought the First World War, but he was more than enthusiastic for the Second. He was a devout supporter of the National Socialists, and, up to that point, was a real scumbag of a human being. I admit freely that I felt no regret in what I did to Fritz, only in the fact that I had to leave my life in Russia behind. Leningrad never fell to the fascists, and Velikai could never see his wife and children again. At this point, I was confused but not alarmed. I suspected dementia was responsible for the strange story. It's easy for old people to mix up stories they'd seen on TV or read in a book with their own experiences. After that ordeal, I spent a few years in Germany. Charles continued. Fritz, having been wounded in battle, was sent to a guard at Auschwitz-Birkenau. David, I want you to know that I am not a monster. When I saw the things that happened in that place, I was horrified. I did what I could to help the starving men, women, and children. I tried to sneak them food from the barracks and helped some of them escape, but there were too many of them. I'm sorry for what you had to go through, Charles, I said. That's alright, Charles said. For the last 70 years, I haven't told anyone about this. I just need to let it all out before I go. I'm not a young man anymore, David. I can sense that my time is almost up. That's alright, Charles, I said, patting his shoulder. I thought he was confused, but decided to tolerate it. That's some heavy stuff there. Let it out. Anyway, 2 years after that, Fritz was sent to the Western Front, to Normandy. On June 6th, the Allies landed, and Fritz was sent to the front lines to defend a bridge. A British paratrooper of the 6th Airborne Division landed 30 meters away from him and promptly shot him in the jaw with a rifle. Charles gestured at himself. That, he continued, was me, Charles Moore. You've never told anyone about your time in the war? I asked, incredulous. No, Charles replied. My family knows, briefly. Why would I tell them anything more? My own son put me here to rot. They're probably looking forward to the time I bite the dust, so they can inherit my fortune. I'm sorry to hear that, Charles, I said. That's alright, he said. It's not like it's your fault. Besides, they aren't getting anything. They didn't earn any of that money. I did. How would you like to inherit 3 million euros? I was stunned. I can't accept that, Mr. Moore, I stuttered. Give it to someone who needs it. Give it to a charity. I don't deserve that money. He tried to persuade me, but I was adamant in my refusal. 1 week later, my coworker, Andrew, approached me during a break period for caretakers. Andrew's face was glowing and his eyes twinkled with excitement. "David," he said, with a huge grin on his face. "You remember something I told you a long time ago about old folks writing me into their wills?" Andrew was an opportunistic bastard. He told me once why he decided to join the medical industry and work in a care home. "The old folks here are angry and cynical. Who wouldn't be if they were abandoned by their ungrateful children and stuffed in a care home? All it takes is a bit of compassion and a show of kindness. And the next thing you know, they're written their kids out of their wills and left you everything. This happens, Dave. And it happens more than you think. Cha-ching." "Yeah?" I replied. "I suppose Charles Moore decided to leave you something?" €3 million, he yelled. "And he's getting his will updated tomorrow. I knew something like this would happen. I told you so." "Good for you, Andrew," I said, and offered a polite smile. "I'm happy for you." "You bloody well should be," Andrew said. "Once that will is updated, and I make sure the geezer doesn't change his mind before he bites the dust, I'm out of here." Andrew was an asshole, but did he deserve what happened to him? Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. The lawyers determined Mr. Moore to be sound of mind, and the will was smoothly rewritten. 1 month after our conversation, I was on night patrol duty. Basically, caretakers have to take shifts checking on the elderly while they sleep, to make sure they take their medicine and to help them into their beds. While I was walking down the hallway, I noticed that Mr. Moore's door was ajar. I took a glance into his room and saw Andrew sitting next to Charles Moore, who was fast asleep in his bed. Andrew seemed to be deliberating, and his face was scrunched up in thought, as if he were having an internal struggle. Suddenly, he stood up. He extended his right hand and grabbed a pillow from Charles' bed. I was alarmed. What is he up to? And then I realized Andrew was impatient. I was alarmed and took a stride towards the door. Suddenly, Charles bolted up. His speed was uncanny. It wasn't the demeanor of an old man. Andrew was shocked. He dropped the pillow and smiled haplessly when Charles turned to stare at him. The corner of Charles' lips crawled up his face to form a blood-curdling grin. His teeth were showing, and I saw how small and sharp and many his teeth were. They reminded me, at that absurd moment, of the teeth of a great white shark. Charles, no, that wasn't his name, for he had no name, opened his mouth as Andrew backed up against the wall of the room in sheer terror. A giant, black, eel-like tongue protruded from the yawning jaws of the thing that sat in Charles Moore's bed. It slithered and curved towards Andrew, now helpless and totally frozen. At that moment, Andrew turned away from the thing and saw me looking through the gap. His expression was a mixture of confusion and of unholy horror. He opened his mouth to scream, but he never did. The tongue shoved itself into his mouth and into his head. His body went limp, and his eyes rotated into his skull. I remember staring at Andrew's convulsing body, unable to move. I was numb with terror, but also filled with a morbid curiosity. A few minutes later, the black tongue of the thing began to recede, slowly back into Charles' body. Once it left Andrew, he stopped convulsing. A minute later, Andrew started to stare. Suddenly, his eyes opened. To my horror, his bloodshot eyes stared, unflinchingly, right into me. "David," Andrew said, "I did what I had to survive. I hope you understand." I felt hot and thick bile shooting into my mouth. I clamped a hand over it, turned, and bolted from the door. Mr. Charles Moore was pronounced dead the next day. According to the doctor, he had died of natural causes. There was no suspicion of foul play. Andrew White inherited the €3 million. Despite a fierce court battle, Charles' children failed to undo his last will and testament. I will never forget what I saw that night in that room, and no amount of therapy will make it easier to sleep at night. But when I think back, I can't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the thing that was Charles. Just when I started getting back up on my feet, Lady Luck smiling down on me. That's when it all began. The dreaming. Everyone is different, but the same. An episode in some strange series I've unwittingly subscribed to. I'll be walking home from school. I'll be on the way to visit father in the care home. I'll be waiting outside of the infirmary whilst mother's gone now. And I swear blind because it's all because of them. No matter where I am, no matter where I'm going, there'll be a briefcase. A tired-looking thing with jaws clasped shut, leather frowning, beckoning for me to come, to open it. And even though I know that they'll be waiting on the inside, I can't help myself, each and every time. I've been awake for 40 hours now, perhaps more, fueled merely by a fear that when I close my eyes, I'll see that dreaded briefcase of misfortune, and God only knows what they'll be wanting to take next. Although it might seem crazy to the outside world, or to whomever might be reading this, I've locked myself inside the boiler cupboard. No natural light, just candles lit around me. The haphazard thrumming of the great black boiler keeping me from nodding off. I'm safe here. No windows, no mirrors looking in. That's how they do it. I'm certain of that if of nothing else. That's how they break me from the briefcase, from my dreams. My father's probably out looking for me. Worried sick, no doubt. West Harrington isn't all that big a town. We've lived here for all our lives. My father, mother, and I. My sister left just as soon as she was old enough to drive. I think I'm slowly starting to realize why. As for the dream, and what happened to my mother, that's what you're really here to read about, isn't it? I'm sure you've had a similar experience before. Something so terrifying that it wraps its arms around you and won't let go. Not even when you wake. Sleep paralysis, or so it's called. The first time I ever saw them, it was back in school. Inside my mind's eye, a science class, banks of wooden desks left empty, save for me, Marianne, Peter Boy, and the professor. Peter Boy wasn't his name, but it wasn't quite a nickname either. It was just a spoken fact. We were 16, 17, and those elder few were 18, so surely Peter Boy was one of them, but in truth, he looked no older than Marianne's little sister, 8, maybe 9 at a push. It wasn't his height, it was his face, his childlike demeanor, and I'm sure you've guessed by now. If I was friends with Peter Boy, then it's safe to say I wasn't all that popular. But here, inside my head, popularity doesn't matter. I'm sitting at my desk, talking cell division with Marianne, whilst Peter Boy is drawing something obscene with his textbook. And it's quiet. Not even the professor dares to speak. My voice is barely a whisper, if that. The lights had been dimmed, and I'm certain there was a reason for this having been done, but I can't recall why, and I wish that I could. Marianne's hazel eyes are sharp and then not quite dark, looking through me, back and over my shoulder. The professor doesn't have a face. He lost that sometime between when the ceiling tiles started crumbling and the desks began to rot. Peter Boy's scribbling is growing ever faster, ever more determined. He's muttering under his breath and sweating something awful. Don't disturb him. He isn't done. That's what Marianne's lips appear to mouth. And then I see it, sat there under the desk, my foot catching on the lid each time I swing it back and forth. The briefcase, upturned in a grimace, and I could swear that it had eyes. Marianne urges me to wait, that I shouldn't touch it until Peter Boy is finished. It's important, what he's drawing. It's not just another drawing. But I don't want to wait, because the dust from up above, from the tiles that are crumbling, it's falling into my eyes, clawing past my lips and digging deep into my throat. I try to cough, but I can't. My throat is too coarse. As for the desk, Peter Boy won't finish. It's on its last legs. The rot is reaching for the briefcase. It wants to open itself, knotted fingers calling out to some secret hiding underneath the lid. The professor disappeared, although I can hear his footsteps in the dark. Marianne shrugs. She smiles and says, "Slow and steady wins the race." What race? The suitcase, of course. Whoever lays their fingers on it first, they'll win the secret. They'll get what's coming to them from the inside. I can't wait. Peter Boy is taking far too long. Perhaps I'll wish I'd waited. But right here, right now, all I want to do is open up the leather joker idling beneath my feet, to take a peek. So I reach out, against that nagging voice of sanity that begs I stay away. I press my fingers to the catch of the leather-clad creature, and I tear apart its jaws to look inside. They come in different forms. They never wear the same skin twice. They think that if they change their face, you won't recognize them, and perhaps they're right. Their hope is to break through the barrier between the mind and our reality. That knocking? No, it's not the boiler. I think it might be Mother, but she's not Mother anymore. My only hope is that Father is still out there looking, that he's as far away from her as possible. Why is it so quiet? The candles. They're going out. One by one, the dark is drawing in. Over 40 hours now, and by the gods, my mind is wandering. I'm tired. I just don't want to sleep. I woke up and started my day with a brisk cold shower. My feet traversed the oak staircase, down to the kitchen, where I only had time to scrounge together some eggs. I then headed to work. I got off my shift at 5 and then I made my way to get something to eat from Chick-fil-A. I got a chicken sandwich and a milkshake, and then I made my way home after that. I got home and let my dog out. I got out some leftovers from the other night to make dinner and loaded up my PC. I play a lot of video games to relax. I basically play in my free time, like before I go to bed. The next day, I only got called into work for a couple hours, which was nice because I was super tired. After I got home, I went up to my room to play some guitar and just jam out for a little bit. I got pretty bored of that soon, so I just turned my Xbox on in the living room and put my feet up to play my favorite game for a little while. It was getting pretty late by this point, so I threw a Netflix show on to fall asleep watching. It was around midnight at this point, and I was pretty sleepy. I think I dozed off pretty soon after that, but I was woken up a little while later by some type of sound. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, because I was half asleep, but it definitely woke me up. It was pretty loud, and I thought it came from out front of my house. It was pretty damn close anyway. It was like a light, high-pitched sound, almost like someone was playing a violin with a piece of rusty scrap metal outside of my window. I didn't really think much of it at the time. I was half asleep, and I really didn't care at the time, so I just went back to sleep. I woke up around 11 in the morning, and I felt like absolute shit. It felt like I was hungover, which was odd because I had nothing to drink the night before. I had a horrible headache and a slight ringing in my ear. I went to the medicine cabinet, grabbed 2 Tylenol out of the bottle, and took them. A little while after that, my headache started to calm down, and the ringing eventually stopped. I had to have had 2 cups of coffee at this point, not only because I felt awful, but because I am definitely a coffee addict. There's no doubt about it. I'm a total caffeine fiend, because it really helps me focus. Thankfully, I wasn't scheduled to work until later that day, but I was going to see how I felt about working later. I was mostly waiting to see if I was even up to it. Something about that day felt off, as if some presence was watching my routine as a play upon a stage. I was alone, except for Gracie, but it felt like I was being watched. I was restless, and I just didn't want to be in the house anymore. I thought that maybe it was because I wasn't feeling good earlier, so I thought maybe some fresh air would do me some good. I got the dog's leash, loaded us up in the car, and took my Gracie for a walk to the park. I thought once I got back I would feel better from just getting some fresh air. We walked in the park for almost an hour, and while I was there I discovered something strange. I was walking Gracie on a path in the woods which I hadn't tread recently, but could remember taking in the near distant past. All of a sudden, my dog started freaking out and growling to the left of me. I looked over to see what she was barking at, but I couldn't see anything. It was totally out of character for her, as I had never seen her act so defensively before. I was sure that she had definitely either seen or could sense something out there that I couldn't. This piqued my curiosity, so I decided to investigate. I walked off the path, letting her lead me. Gracie was pulling the leash so hard, I tripped a couple times. She was choking herself just trying to get there. I was walking for what seemed to be forever, until we finally got to where she was leading me. It was in the middle of the woods, but above me was a huge, circular clearing in the trees, which was super random, because there were trees all around except in this one circle. On the ground there was nothing but grass, but it was growing in a very weird way. In the almost hexagonal shaped area, it didn't look very natural at all, and my dog was now ripping up the grass, digging for something. There was something under there, and she was going to find it. Everything that came next happened so fast. Gracie had dug up what looked like a bone. It was this dirty, yellowish white stick, and I grabbed it out of Gracie's mouth. I then examined it further, and then realized maggots were festering inside, surely making a meal of whatever marrow was left. One even crawled onto my hand, and at that point, I did my best Derek Jeter impression and threw the bone halfway across the field. I yelled at Gracie not to go after it. I then started jogging back to the path, and Gracie and I ran straight back to my car and drove home. I was just disgusted at what I saw, but I was also very curious about why there was a relatively large bone buried in the woods. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. I didn't get much sleep that night, because I was trying to understand it all. The odd circle in the middle of the woods with no trees in that one area, the bone that belonged to a large animal that was buried. I wanted to go back, and maybe do a little investigating so I could really see what was happening. It was around 1 in the morning at the time, and I heard a large whoosh come over my house, almost like an airplane flying over. You know how if you stand on the ground and a jet flies by flying low? Well, that was the sound that came over my house. I was startled from brainstorming ideas of what could be out in the woods when the loud sound went over my house. I got right up without blinking an eye and headed downstairs. I hopped in my car and flew down my street towards the park. I was 2 streets away from the park at a stop sign when I saw something in the air above the woods. It looked large and black, and I couldn't quite make out any details, but there was a light underneath, and it was shining down on something I couldn't quite see. I quickly made my way towards it, trying to keep my eye on it while driving at the same time. Nobody was out this late at night, and the street was mostly dark with a few flickering street lights. I parked my car in the park's parking lot and got out. I didn't have much on me except for my phone, which I had in hand, and I turned the flashlight app on to see. I was on the same path I was on earlier, and all of a sudden I started to hear this chanting. It almost sounded like some kind of ritual chant, like the kind the monks do, but it sounded oddly pleasant. The chant almost sounded like a choir filled with beautiful voices. I didn't want to disturb whoever was making the sound, and I didn't know what else to do, so forgetting why I was there in the first place, I started to head back. I had gotten back to my car when I saw that thing in the sky again. It was almost hovering over me for a second, and the next, when I looked back up at it, it just disappeared. It was there 1 second, and gone the next. It was like something out of a movie, but this was real and right in front of my face. I hopped in my car and quickly sped off. I got to my house and went right to my bed. I made sure all my doors were locked first though, because I was pretty frightened. I had no idea what I had seen, so I tried forgetting about it and just falling asleep. I don't know how much sleep I got that night, but I woke up around 1. Knowing I wouldn't be getting any more sleep anyway, I went online. I was researching the flying thing I saw in the sky to see if anyone saw the same thing. I quickly realized that what I saw that night was a UFO. The way it acted, and how it defied physics, added up. It hovered without moving, and then flew away within microseconds. No man-made thing can do what that thing did. My brain then sparked the second thing I witnessed, the chanting. I messaged a couple of my online buddies about what I saw, and they suggested that it was some type of cult. I told them about how I saw the circle in the middle of the woods, and the hexagon-shaped grassy area, and they sent me this article on a nearby cult ritual that took place in the 80s where they sacrificed a little boy. It was all over the paper back then, and whispered about around town. If you lived here, you would know about this story. There was speculation about if this cult was still functioning, or if it was even still around today. Most people thought that all the members had either died out or moved on. So I was sitting there thinking to myself about how I just found this strange cult that nobody knows about. Now, I really wondered if the UFO was connected to this strange cult. I tried to go about my day like usual. I went grocery shopping and ran a couple other errands. While I was out, I saw this really cool laser, which was green like the kind of tactical laser they use in the military. I got it for around $50, because I'm into that type of weird stuff. I wanted to use it next time I went out to explore the woods, and maybe to mess around with a couple of my neighbors. Nothing odd happened that week until Saturday. This is when I saw something I never should have seen. It was Saturday night, around 3 in the morning. The moon was full, and the wackos were out. You know what they say about the full moon and the crazies? Well, tonight that was the truth. I couldn't help myself but to explore the dark and spooky woods. I really wanted to know where that beautiful chant was coming from. The way I would describe it would almost be like a siren's calling. A siren is a mythical creature that would lure in unknowing sailors to their death by their enchanting song. It was like this, but a choir all in unison, together chanting this song. I still can't describe it in words. But I needed to find the source of it, and I was going to. So, I was walking around on and off the path until I came across where I witnessed it last. I saw a dimly lit flame far ahead of me in the woods. I couldn't make out much around it though, because of the trees and brush around me. I started to make my way over to it, watching my steps so I wouldn't alert anyone to my presence. If I was going to see what was happening, I would need to do it secretly and silently. I thought I knew what I was getting myself into in reading those articles online. This was a cult where they did rituals to someone, or something, for God knows what reason. I could feel my adrenaline start kicking in just thinking about what I might see. For me, the danger just added to my excitement. It was like a key to my own personal door of blissfulness. I believe that once you aren't afraid of death and the unknown, then you can unlock the real joy of life. Some might say I'm a thrill seeker, but I like to call it my addiction. When I am in a situation I shouldn't be in, I feel as if I am whole. I break through a threshold of right and wrong, and the reward is stimulation to my mind. It might sound a bit crazy to you, but aren't we all a bit crazy in some ways? Anyway, as I was creeping up on this fire, I saw multiple people around it. I ducked down in the brush, trying to camouflage myself as best as I can. I was glad that I had thought to wear dark clothes that night. It really helped me to camouflage myself better in the dark woods. I started to listen to what those people were saying. I was probably 30 yards away at this point. They began to chant that song, and it filled the air with this almost joyous feeling. I felt good just listening to it. It wasn't scary, and it didn't make me feel like I was in any danger. I was just oddly at peace. I continued to watch to see what they were going to do next. They started to switch from the chant to a constant repetition of this one word which seemed to be in some type of, possibly, ancient language I didn't recognize. They repeated this one word over and over again. I had no clue what would happen next, but then they doused the fire in gasoline, shooting embers up into the moonlit sky. All of a sudden, I remember seeing someone bring some type of squealing animal out. The creature had to be in pain because of the cries that this animal was making. They laid it on the ground and sprinkled it with some sort of dust while continuing the chanting. I saw one of the members take a large knife that was glowing red from the fire. He took the knife and sank it right into the animal's neck, spewing blood everywhere, as the poor thing cried out one last time. Then they took the lifeless corpse of the animal and threw it into the raging fire in the middle of the circle. It caught pretty quickly and suddenly a putrid smell rushed my nose. It was the smell of rotten flesh being boiled. They all began to chant louder and louder, all rising up, stretching their arms and lifting their hands to the sky like they were all reaching for something. I was in shock of what I just saw, but I wasn't scared. My adrenaline now was pumping so fast through my veins I could feel it. I knew I had to get out of there before the sunrise, which would be soon. It was almost 5 a.m. at this point. The sun would be coming up and revealing my position within the hour. Out of nowhere they all stopped, and that made me nervous. It was dead quiet to the point where you could hear a pin drop. I heard distant birds chirping and a couple crickets here and there. I then felt something slither across my leg. This made me jump a little, because I wasn't too fond of snakes, but I knew I still needed to remain calm. As I moved my leg, a branch cracked under me. At this point, it was still dead quiet, and I knew someone had to have heard that. I looked up towards where the ritual was taking place. I peeked my head over the bush and saw someone looking directly at me. Then, as if the rest of the world quit existing, it was me and this cult member, eye to eye, about 30 yards apart. There were so many thoughts running through my mind at the time, but the only one that stood out the most was, run. I stood up, and with my adrenaline-pumped legs, ran as fast as I could back to the path. I was pretty muddy from lying down in the dirt for the last hour, and I looked like shit. I wanted to look back to see if anyone was chasing after me, but I was too focused on getting to my car and getting the hell out of this park. I got back to my car, clicking the unlock button on my keys multiple times before it opened, and finally I got in my driver's seat. I locked the doors and turned the engine on. It was still fairly dark out at this time, and my car lights were on. The lights were pointed right towards where I just ran from. It was foggy. but I could make out an abnormally tall man with some type of mask on in the distance. The man was standing on the path holding something in his hands. I tried making out what it was, and it looked like it could be a baseball bat with nails in it. I put my car in reverse and sped out of there trying to make sense of what just happened. The rest of the day I just sat in my bed, thinking. I sat there for hours just trying to understand what I saw. I knew that I saw a cult doing a ritual. I wondered what the man would have done to me if he ever caught up to me. Knowing me, despite the events that had happened that night, it wouldn't stop me from exploring even more. That was yesterday. I went to Walmart today and bought some motion-activated cameras and some other kinds of trail cameras, like the kind that hunters use, that take pictures every few minutes. They also have night vision too. All the videos and pictures that are taken on these cameras will be sent directly to my phone via an app. I plan on setting these cameras up where the ritual happened. There is a chance I will get nothing back, because the cultists might go somewhere else. Otherwise, I plan to record them doing whatever it was they were doing. Either way, I was planning on setting up these later today while it is still light out, and will report back with what I get. Update. I just got back from setting everything up, and everything is good to go. I can access the live feed from my cell phone, which is definitely going to come in handy. I also went back to where Gracie found that bone to see if I could find anything else. The last time I was there with my dog, I ran off in a hurry. While I was looking around, I found a piece of paper that was pretty ripped up laying on the ground. It was pinned down under this rock, so it wouldn't blow away from the wind. I started to try and make out what was written on it. I could only make out a few sentences. Here's what it said. The blood of the little one is forever sacred. We bless our sacrifice with the ashes of our past. Unison is all, and all is forever. There was this ancient language, and I tried looking up what it meant. After a few Google searches, I discovered that it was in Greek, and it meant Hail Leader, as in the one who they sacrificed to. I found it amusing that the language they were using was Greek, a reason that this cult must stem all the way back to ancient Greece. It was around 9 p.m. now, and I was preparing myself for the night. Before I had left the woods, I made sure that when I walked in front of where I placed the cameras that they would all take my picture. The cameras worked just like they should, with very high quality pictures. The only thing I was worried about was if I would be able to make out any pictures that were taken in the dark. There was a night vision mode on the cameras, so I hope that it doesn't make the quality unbearable. I bought this one specific camera that had this really high-tech thermal lens. It takes a picture if it detects body heat, so nobody and nothing that is warm-blooded could pass by without getting their picture taken. For what this whole situation is, I think I'm prepared pretty well. I don't really have a plan B if something goes wrong, so I guess I'll keep this post saved on my computer. This way, if something bad happens to me, or I go missing, then whoever finds this will know what has happened in that time. I made myself some dinner and put some Netflix on to make time go faster until it was time to leave. I planned on leaving around 2 a.m. and to be near the park just watching the cameras on my phone. I was a decently patient person, so I could sit there for hours and wait until something happens. After watching a couple episodes of my favorite show, I got up to go to the bathroom. My bathroom has a window that you can see my backyard from. I was just doing my business when I thought I heard something rustling around out back. I peeked through the blinds from my bathroom and didn't see anyone. I washed my hands and headed downstairs to turn the outside lights on. I had a better angle now to view the whole backyard. I turned the lights on, but I didn't see anything then either. I started to chalk it up to my mind just playing dumb tricks on me because of what I would be doing that night. I turned the lights back off, and all of a sudden I could see this shadowy figure that was far back at the edge of my fence. It was just standing there, apparently doing nothing. I closed my eyes, holding them shut for a long moment before I opened them again, because maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I opened my eyes again, it was still there. The figure was solid black and unusually tall. I would say it had to be at least 7 feet tall. I turned my lights back on, and it instantly disappeared. It was almost 1 a.m. at this point, but I felt compelled to leave early. I made sure all my doors were locked, and I headed to my car. Tonight was just getting started. I got into my car, put my keys in the ignition, started the engine, and I pulled out of my driveway. I headed to the parking lot of a closed coffee shop that was nearby to the woods. I turned my car off and plugged my phone in to charge it. I loaded up the camera app to see what was currently going on, and there was nothing. What a surprise. I thought. I'm not too sure how long I waited, but it had to have been a few hours before something caught my interest. A notification popped up saying Camera 1 has activity. Click here for details. I clicked the notification and I pulled the feed up. I couldn't make anything out, so I turned the night vision mode on. As I turned this mode on, I could see to the far left of the screen 2 tiny glowing eyes. I tried zooming in, but it wouldn't let me. I swiped over to my other cameras to try to make sense of what I was seeing. Camera 2 was the same, but now there was double the eyes. You know how a cat's eyes glow in the dark? Well, it was the same thing, but it had to have been 7 feet in the air. I went to my third camera, and I could finally make out a person. They had to be wearing some kind of dark colored robe, because I couldn't make out any features on it. It also had this weird mask on. It appeared to be some type of animal skull with sticks coming out of it. This thing was wearing an animal skull on its head. Then, I remembered I had my thermal camera. I quickly pulled up the video feed and clicked the scan area option. This was the oddest thing, because it should have lit up like a Christmas tree in shades of red. It was actually quite the opposite. These things were cold as ice. No high temperatures were recorded. I only knew where they were, because their bodies were outlined in the cool blue color of temperatures 40 degrees and below. As I was focusing on this, something else caught my eye. The temperature meter lit up in the middle of the circle. It was the fire, and the temperature meter was the highest it could get. The ritual was beginning. This didn't make any sense at all. If they were human, it would be reading above 98 degrees, but these things in dark robes were colder than ice. The meter doesn't read below 40 degrees, so I can only assume they had ice water for blood. I looked at the clock and saw that it was 4 a.m., and shit was now getting real. My curiosity was beyond peaked at this point. Then, out of nowhere, something lit up the camera with a bright light. I couldn't see anything but this large, super bright light. I switched over to my thermal camera to see what it was recording. Above 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This was some crazy shit. The huge light, which I still have no clue as to where it came from, was hotter than that fire. I had only been looking at this light for a minute when I started to get error warnings from the apps. The error is read, camera non-functional, please reset. I was really curious now that all of my cameras weren't working because of the heat. This huge light from the sky melted my cameras, and somehow these people are still alive. This was impossible. It had to be a mistake of some kind, an equipment malfunction of some kind maybe. Because if this light was hotter than the fire, then shouldn't it kill those things? I was on my way over to the park, and that's when it hit me. The light was from the UFO I saw earlier in the week. That was the only explanation I could come up with. I had just gotten to the park and parked my car in the lot. I felt the adrenaline starting to slowly course its way through my body. I was moments away from seeing what was going on in the middle of the woods. I was walking on the path, and I slowly began to see this very bright, exposing light. It looked like a spotlight, but was shining directly in my face. I was so fascinated and curious as hell to see what it was. It was still hovering over where the ritual was taking place. I crept my way down into the bush, and that's when I saw him. He was wearing this dark, raggy looking robe, that large animal skull mask on his head, and had bright blue piercing eyes. When I tell you those eyes stared through your soul, I mean it. It was obvious to me that these cult members weren't human. The way they did everything so in unison without missing a beat. The way they walked with their long legs. Most of the members were at least 7 feet tall or so. The tallest one was probably 8 feet, with these long, inhuman arms. The way they stretched and morphed was unnerving. I saw him bend down, and it almost looked like he broke his arm, and then snapped it back into place without flinching. I found all of this absolutely fascinating. Every bit of it pumped more adrenaline through my veins and into my brain. I was feeling amazing, but also killer focused. I was now on a task to get a picture of this UFO. I took my phone out and brought the camera app up. I didn't blink once and zoomed in on the light. The damn light was so bright it wouldn't focus for 1 second. I held the focus to sustain it, and it started to clear at this point when I saw him. He looked over towards me and didn't move. He just stood there without breathing, staring at me. This thing, this monstrosity, and not even 20 feet away from me, was staring through me with those piercing blue, unnatural eyes. I had no clue what to do at this point, so I took the picture and bolted. When I thought I couldn't have ran faster, I was overcome by my fight or flight instinct of, I know I'm going to die, and I ran faster than ever. I began to hear multiple voices of them yelling in this deep, ancient dialect. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. I was running on the path at this point when I felt this horrible stomach cramp. The cramp was accompanied by that familiar piercing headache and a dull ringing in my ears. My survival instincts kicked into overdrive, screaming at me to get to my car. A few blurry moments later, and I got back to the parking lot. I already had my car unlocked, so I jumped in and turned my engine on faster than I ever had before. I got out of there, leaving skid marks behind me, and then while I was driving down the road, I felt an instant sense of relief and safety. I was safe, for now at least. But that is it, isn't it? I have no clue whether or not I'll be alive in the next few days. I've decided to put my house up for sale and legally change my name. I've already quit my job, and I'm ready to leave this shitty town behind. I'll be posting this document of my experience with this cult. I just hope they don't find me. Or maybe they already have. The reason I say that is because I've had some weird shit happen to me recently. While I was going to my local grocery store the other day, I saw something strange. I was coming out of the store while looking at my phone, and all of a sudden it was a notification from the camera app. You see, I obviously never went back there. I thought that the notification had to be a glitch, since I knew the damn cameras were all apparently destroyed. It said, "Camera 1 has activity. Click here for details." I clicked on it, and what I saw shocked me. It was a child, all alone with only a hat on his head. Then, one of those things wearing a dark robe came over, blocking the camera's view. I couldn't see what was happening because he was standing in front of it at this point. My stomach sank just thinking about what I was about to witness. But then it just went black. The screen cut out, and that damn message popped up. "Camera non-functional. Please reset." What happened next is why I am leaving town and never coming back. I began to feel this weight fall over my chest, like an elephant was sitting on me. Then, that ringing in my ears started, just like the night I ran away from that thing. I then saw my phone start to glitch out, and it started to get extremely hot. I mean, like when you leave it in the sun all day hot. It began giving a message saying, "High temperature alert. Please let phone cool before using again." I almost couldn't even hold it because it was too hot. I just put it in my pocket hoping it was just a stupid glitch. Then, my phone began playing a song at full volume. It was the beautiful song that the cult members were chanting in the woods. I neither had made up a recording of the chant, nor did I find it anywhere on the web. My phone had accessed this audio from some external source, but only God knows where it came from. This is what made me tip. This was the last straw for me, and I was no longer curious about this messed up, ancient, extraterrestrial cult. I shut my phone off and threw it in the grocery store trash can. I'm writing all this on my new phone while sitting on a plane awaiting takeoff. I got a solid cash offer on my house, and we settled on a very lush price, so Gracie and I are gone. I'll probably wind up somewhere in Europe. Maybe I'll own a business, like a vineyard off the bay or Naples. Maybe I'll find something in the Maldives Islands, right off the coast of India. I will tell you this much, whoever may be reading this, I'm about to fly somewhere where I can hopefully begin a new life without this constant fear of these inhuman things that are lurking in your town. I saw something I shouldn't have seen, and maybe went too far exploring it. I've experienced a lot in life and I don't care what people say. I know I'm not in control of what happens next, and I've already accepted it. I'll either eventually live out my life somewhere nice and warm, or these supernatural things will find me and end my life one day. I wish I still had that picture I had taken as proof. But the light had melted the camera lens on my now discarded previous phone, and the picture had ended up as a distorted mess anyway. I don't want to know how they might end me, or what they might do to me. I just hope this message, this warning, gets out to the public. There are otherworldly things out there, whether or not you believe it. It's real, and I have seen it with my own eyes. Goodbye now, and wish me luck on wherever I wind up going. Remember to be safe out there, and live life to its fullest, because you never know what could be out there, just waiting for you.